Yeah, I am here to listen to Mr. Damodar, like all of you. I find in the audience also there are many former journalists who used to cover finance, and also I see one of the important another bureaucrat, Mr. Subramanian. Perhaps I have covered him during my reporting days. This subject is interesting, no doubt, it's a contemporary, because we are all curious about these days how the corporate bodies are funding political parties, particularly during the election time. And corporates are funding to political parties, I think, since when the elections start. But point is, the question is now being raised that there is no transparency in the funding, as it was absolutely clear that when the present government introduced the electoral bond, and there was no and Supreme Court struck down that scheme. Then after that we found that how the ruling party normally gets the benefit of all the corporate funding. Some of the corporates are also not listed in the perhaps any. I think Mr. Damodar will be able to enlighten us. They also funded political parties, and those companies were in red. And after that, suddenly there was a quick protocol. We found that many of them got some contracts, government contracts. Not from only the central government, also some of the state governments too. So there should be some kind of a transparency. There is no quick fix solution how this can be transparent. But I think as a former bureaucrat who handled this subject, and he had a lot of experience, about particularly when he was heading SEBI and UTI, he must be knowing how this funding goes from the corporate bodies to political parties and what should be. Rather, I would rather prefer to listen that what could be the solution for transparency in political funding by the corporates and the political parties. So thank you all. I will not, again I will repeat, thank you all.
So without further ado, I think I request Damodaran to give his opening remarks for about 15 minutes, and then we have a short dialogue with the moderator and the speaker, and then we open it to the house. I mean, when we were discussing, who should be speaking in May, we could find a better person than Damodaran to speak on this issue, because after the Supreme Court declared the electoral bond scheme as unconstitutional, we thought this was a very relevant thing. And then with the general elections going on and the result, whatever, but the issue is going to be of some primacy.
I hope when we are done and dusted with this discussion, this conversation, maybe I will be certainly wiser as to what I should have known before I started speaking here. So with that caveat, let me get started. Let me also say this, that nothing of what I say has any political party overtones. For the simple reason that I worked in government for close to 4 decades. I've been working outside thereafter for more than a decade. And I have at no point of time been associated with any political party. Not with any political party, not with any political party persons. Of course, along the way, one did pay the price for what is called political neutrality, but a price worth paying, if you ask me, for sleeping peacefully at night. So when I mentioned to a colleague of mine this morning that I was coming to speak here, these days, I'm much younger than I am, these days youngsters are very smart. She said, okay, disappeared and came back after 10 minutes with something that I'm going to use now. She says, yesterday, the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance has written something which you might find interesting. It was as recent as yesterday. And I crave your indulgence to read a paragraph of what they have written. Ordinarily, I don't like reading texts, particularly if they come from the United States. but this is topically relevant, therefore I'll make an exception. I'm quoting from the report. Over the past year, several corporate executives have expressed a concern to the Center of Political Accountability that the new members of corporate boards often lack a broad knowledge of corporate political spending and what it entails. They see it as impairing new directors' ability to set political spending policies and conduct the due diligence required to protect their company, especially in today's risk-fraught political environment. I thought this applies almost entirely to the situation we have in India today. Directors who do not know what to do with this subject, when it comes to the board, if it comes to the board, do they ask questions, do they ask the right questions on how corporates are proposing to fund political parties. Let's begin at the beginning. We cannot pretend that elections in this country will go on without funding by corporates. Supposing you just turn off that tap and say that there will be starting tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is a little late, we've had 5 phases already, but if you roll back a little bit, if you say at the beginning of the electoral process, somebody enacted a law which says no political funding. Some persons will be very happy because there is a kind of negativity attached to the relationship between corporate funding and the functioning of parties. There was mention of quid pro quo. It can't be wished away, it is there. But these entities that fund political parties are also corporate citizens. And as corporate citizens, they have a responsibility to ensure that the ecosystem of which they are a part is reasonably sound and stable. Supposing money did not come from the corporates, where would it come from? Those that are very rich, have deep pockets, have family fortunes, will be at a huge advantage vis-a-vis the principled, well-intentioned young man or woman who wants to stake his claim and who has no resources to do so. So some of that tends to get addressed if there is external funding. Lots of difficulties involved in that. Elections are expensive business. I think all of us know that, especially people in the press to keep seeing this up close and personal will be in a position to appreciate how electoral spending, poll-related spending has increased over the elections. As was mentioned, I was born in the year of independence, so I have voted in several elections. I've conducted several elections. And the one thing that I have seen is that every election you find more spending than there has been in the previous election. At the candidate level, at the party level, and God knows at what other level, not even getting there. And then we have some limits that the Election Commission has laid down. In this day and age, those limits are laughable. And let me mention to you what they are. In the context of the elections in Andhra Pradesh, the Election Commission sent out a circular which said each assembly candidate can spend up to 40 lakh rupees. This 40 lakh rupees is from nomination till the electoral process is complete. And as you know, there are several stages. It's a long process. For Lok Sabha candidates, it said the limit was 95 lakhs, less than a crore rupees. I think today crore is the unit in which discussions are taking place. When I was growing up, that unit used to be 100 and then 1000. Now, of course, nobody talks about lakhs or millions. It is crores, several hundred crores, and we heard about millions. Now we've moved to billions and trillions. So it's a changed scenario, and these limits are expected to operate in that scenario and deliver a clean, transparent election process. There's no harm wishing that it does so. I don't want to go down that path. Before we come to corporate funding, there are 2 or 3 things I wanted to mention. And I'm looking at this subject through the lens of the corporates and the lens of corporate governance. Not so much the receiving party, which is a political party that receives money. I'm looking at it from the point of view of the giver, the one that's actually making the contribution. In the world of corporate governance, there are 2 things that are very important. Transparency was mentioned. Transparency and disclosure. We live in a disclosure-based regime where anything that stakeholders need to know has to be disclosed in clear fashion. No obfuscation, no incompleteness. You have to tell the full story, and you have to tell it in a manner that the person for whom it is intended understands that. So transparency and disclosure are important. Conflict of interest is something that needs to be rooted out. If conflict of interest exists in a corporate organization, then clearly there are some problems which will surface sooner rather than later, and then all stakeholders will pay the price, not just the promoters, not just the management. Quid pro quo was mentioned. And there is this feeling that everyone that is giving contribution to political parties is expecting something in return. And that's the essence of conflict. That quid pro quo, that demand that yes, I will give you something if I can get something either up front or later, if you believe the commitment. That is, if you believe the commitment. I saw a cartoon recently, an interesting cartoon. So there was little Dennis with his back to the tree, and there was his friend on the other side, and she asked him, do all stories start with once upon a time? And Dennis put her wise and said, no, some stories start with if I get elected. In a move ostensibly to do away with the difficulties of the 2013 Act and encourage the funding of elections, brought in an amendment which did away with provisions of 5 enactments: Companies Act, the Income Tax Act, the RPI Act, the FCRA, and the Representation of People Act. So with that one act, the relevant provisions of all these were knocked out. And as far as the Companies Act is concerned, what did it do? Existence for 3 years disappeared. We didn't need it. The ceiling of 7.5% disappeared. And there were a few other twists and turns which made it very easy for companies which wanted to favor one or more political parties, notwithstanding their existence, notwithstanding their profitability, notwithstanding several other things, you could write out the checks and give them your contribution. And then, of course, electoral bonds came alongside that, which doesn't exist today.
Taking a cue from the overview, the first thing I wanted to ask you was, being the chair of SEBI, and that's how that whole thing about insider trading and everything was opened up. We had a lot of issues earlier. So now, cannot some kind of a regulator be brought into corporate funding? I mean, that's the first question which I would like to put in. And how how will that scenario operate? I mean, you mentioned about the boards and everything.
Yes. Complicate an existing problem, bring in a regulator. I don't think bringing in a regulator is the best solution, because you might get regulators that don't understand ground realities and therefore write regulations every time they wake up in the morning. On the lighter side, it was asked post 2008. I ceased being a regulator. I left before the crisis hit. Somebody asked me, what do you do if regulators every day write new regulations? And that was happening, not in India. Across geographies and across different segments of the financial sector, people were writing new regulations as if their lives depended on it. Because it was a question of self-preservation, self-justification, a defense mechanism to say we do exist and therefore we are putting these regulations. I mentioned to the guy that asked me, figure out when the regulator is waking up in the morning, wake up 2 hours earlier, at least for 2 hours you will be governed by yesterday's regulations. That's the only advice I can give you, otherwise there is no guarantee that no regulations will be introduced. The answer doesn't lie in regulation. The answer lies in everyone who is involved in the process. Understanding that you need to have absence of conflict of interest. This expectation that I will give something to the electoral process in order to get something for my area, my constituency, my company, that is something that should be discouraged, and no regulator can do it. I think it's only public perception and it's only public influence that will do it over time. It won't happen overnight. There have been cases where it is very obvious that there is quid pro quo involved. The only person that admitted quid pro quo in our history was Tanture, for the cement allocation. We did receive donations and he seemed to justify it in some sense, but nobody else had the courage to, even though quid pro quo is continuing on a regular basis. In fact, people that don't understand where these three words come from, which language they also use quid pro quo. So it is part of common vocabulary. So I think the answer is that you need to avoid conflicts. You need to avoid, as you said about insider trading, you need to avoid, to the extent possible, asymmetry of information. These are what I call the terrible twins in the space of governance. You should root out conflict of interest, you should minimize asymmetry of information, don't go there. There will always be people that have information faster, that have more information, that have qualitatively better information. But you need to reduce it to the extent possible by erecting whatever safeguards are. Will that address the question that, shall we say, corporate funding without funding of political parties, without any guidelines, without any provisions of law, will that improve? It will. But you don't need a regulator to do that. So long as there are ceilings that are prescribed, so long as there are conditions precedent to contributions being made, and so long as there is a watchful stakeholder community and where the media is very, very observant and makes the right comments, some of that will get addressed. After all, political parties are not in this business for short-term gains. They too are looking at long-term existence on how they can continue to be in existence. Companies also would want to be around for a long time. It is not that I make some money today, so tomorrow the company can go well. It can't be that. They are not scared to take a decision because at that stage in life they are not worried about the consequences. You need to get that kind of people. There are some retired Supreme Court judges who tick that box. I'm sure there could be several others who tick that box who are fairly eminent. I wouldn't look for someone who has his or her life ahead of them because a presumption would be that they can get compromised. Presumption may not be the reality. Young people would be at least as principled.
We had the instance of Rajagopalachari writing to JRD Tata for a contribution to the new party he was launching, the Swatantra Party. And promptly JRD wrote to Nehru that, the Rajagopalachari has asked for a contribution, and I think it is in the democratic polity interest that we give them also. And then Nehru said, yes, you can do what you want, but they're not going to get many seats. Anyway, that's another story. But what I'm just saying is that those were different times, and now it's, I grab your pocket and I clean your pocket, So in this kind of a scenario, will this electoral trust work? I just want to put it to you.
It will. In fact, if you don't have too many trusts possible, is that a guarantee that it will work every time. Maybe it will fail, but we are looking at where we are now, what we can do to improve matters. To my mind, that is the way. Since you mentioned Rajagopalachari, I'm sure friends from the press might know of this. When he was the Chief Minister of Madras, and he was in favor of prohibition. One of his Chettiar friends was having permits, but he was also financial on the part. So he asked for an increase in his quota. Now, Rajaji was in two minds. Here was his friend who looked like desperately needed to get a higher quota, and at the same time he was the votary of prohibition, the evangelist of prohibition. So the man who used to clear all his papers within a few minutes kept that paper with him for 2-3 days because he wanted to know what to write. And then he wrote on that, let him drink and die.
आपने बड़ा अच्छा कंटेंट जो है बताया और मुझे समझ में आ गया। जैसे सर ने भी पूछा है, तो ये जो नेशनल इलेक्शन फंड की आपने बात कही है, इसका होना एक अनिवार्य ऐसा लगता है, जरूरी लगता है। और इसके लिए पॉलिटिकल ना होके अगर सेक्रेटरी फाइनेंस, होम, डिफेंस कोई भी उनका काउंसिल बन जाए और सुप्रीम कोर्ट के कोई जज जो है वो उसको मॉनिटर करे, तो ये नेशनल फंड तो हमें समझ में आ गए। ये पूछ रहे क्या ये हो सकता है? दूसरी बात जो है, जब पॉलिटिकल पार्टी रिकॉग्नाइज होती है तो चीफ इलेक्शन कमीशन एक जैसे कंपनी लॉ में मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन होता है, एक आर्टिकल ऑफ एसोसिएशन, ये उनको देना जरूरी होना चाहिए। जब कंपनी लॉ एक छोटा सा कंपनी है और आप एक बड़ी भारी पार्टी बना रहे हैं, तो आपके पास कोई मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन, आप क्या करना चाहते हैं वो मेमोरेंडम में लिखिए, और आप कैसे करेंगे वो आर्टिकल ऑफ एसोसिएशन। तो ये दोनों क्या संभव है, और इसमें जो जैसे सर ने बोला कि रेगुलेटर होना चाहिए, मैं इसको रेगुलेटर ना कह के एक नेशनल फंड अथॉरिटी, जैसे आपने बहुत सारी अथॉरिटी बना रखी है, तो नेशनल फंड अथॉरिटी भी हो सकती है कि नहीं, ये तो 3 क्वेश्चन अगर आप मुझे समझा दें तो बड़ी मेहरबानी।
You talked about Harvard law that study. There was a study by the Harvard Business Review 2 years ago on corporate donations to political parties. Now that took the view, and of course they were looking completely at the American context. They took the view that corporate donations should be completely eliminated. The fact being, the rationale being that investors, stakeholders in the party, in the company, were not aware of what the company was doing. Your board is taking the decision, but are you asking the stakeholders? Are you asking the investors? The shareholders? So who is taking the decision? Just the people at the top. The company is comprised of so many people, so many stakeholders. So it's not an individual. Take a decision, I like this political party. And if you will recall, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw pointed out when she about a donation, she said, I have made it in my personal capacity. It was not her firm.
I know, I sit on Kiran's board.
Yeah. So, you have talked about a national election fund, electoral trusts, or taking 1% cess, which are all excellent ideas. In all those, especially of the cess, those are ideas where you are raising funds without going to the corporates. So can we have a system without having corporate donations, where again the situation of conflict of interest then is ruled out? Individuals can donate, plus you can take the cess if you like.
Money through the National Election Fund, or by a cess, or by any other manner, without recourse to corporate donations, you can certainly run the elections. The point is that historically, business and politics have had a relationship. If you go back several years, some of our most respected political leaders had close relationships with business houses. And I am differentiating business and corporate. The corporate is a structured entity A businessman is an individual with deep pockets possibly, and therefore he or she can fund it. As Kiran said, I will write out checks on my own, leave my company, it doesn't matter. Right? So you can have that, but you can't have a complete, shall we say, break between corporates and the political process, because at the end of the day, corporates are also stakeholders in our political system. The point is, how do you ensure that they contribute to the process and in a manner where the company's interests are kept uppermost? What you mentioned is an ideal situation where you go to the shareholders and other stakeholders and say, I've got this demand, what do you guys think I should do? It won't work that way. The board is the repository of the interests of the stakeholders. That's a presumption. Whether it works that way or not, you can have variations. But because the board is actually empowered to act on behalf of the stakeholders, the board takes those decisions. My worry is that the board should do its job. If the board did its job properly, they will be reflecting the interests of all those other people who are outside, who are not actively a part of the process. Because the board is then thinking of it from the point of view of the company, and what is the company? It's a collection of the stakeholders' interests. That is what the company is about. So I think there is much to be said for an election fund. Again, once you introduce it, if that runs into any problems, then you need to have plan B. Are we then going back to the present system of reaching out directly to the corporates? Or do we want a halfway house? Most companies, most organizations do pilot projects. You want a halfway house where you say, okay, 50% we will give you fund, the rest let the corporates fund. There are variations on this theme that you
but
can.
Then the conflict of interest arises for corporates.
No, the conflict will arise only if there is a benefit that is directly relatable to this particular contribution that you make. Now that will happen if I give it to a political party which is in government and which can favor it. If it goes into the corpus, you don't know whose money is going where. You're contributing to the corpus, and the people that administer the corpus on the basis of certain predetermined formula then distribute. Qureshi said it should be on the basis of 100 rupees per vote cast, but there are several other formulations you can look at it on that basis. Some time ago there was a condition that contributions can be made only to political parties which have inner party democracy. Now don't ask me what is inner party democracy, that's a subject for another discussion, but there was a provision which said, now it's discontinued, nobody is asking that question. It is the responsibility of the Election Commission to ensure that these parties have a constitution, that parties have elections, and that parties have several other safeguards built into it. And if that is in existence, every party follows that, clearly things will improve. I think elections many parties have not had for years, for decades in fact. You know that they come fairly close, they announce everything, but that's why I said I don't know what is inner party democracy, so don't ask me to explain that. As for asking the Finance Secretary, the Home Secretary and the Defence Secretary to look after that, I think they will come under more pressure than even corporates are, because they're part of the government. If they're part of the government, and this is a large responsibility, that you are actually collecting a lot of money and then deciding who will get what. Whether a Supreme Court judge supervises it or not is not material. The first cut is what these three gentlemen are going to do. And I think we should not subject them. These are holders of office who are already subject to enough stresses and strains. We should not add to the problems, which is why I said retired people, sufficiently old, sufficiently credible, they should be the ones that determine. So
I think it's basically a work in progress. So, I mean, we can't come to any substantial answers or any substantial thinking about it, because it's all open. But the point is, it's important to discuss these things so that we can, think about it more and bring it to the fore. Thank you very much.
It's not my membership card.
No.
He's being diplomatic.